Be standing next to this wonderful man, Dick McGuire, who, as all of you know, he is the former commissioner of the New York Agriculture and Markets, and he is the recipient of the American Farm Bureau's Distinguished Service Award. Goes on and on. He was the vice president of the National Association of the Department of Agriculture and the former senior agriculture consultant for Key Bank. I don't know when he found the time to organize Penepee Farm and all the museums, because he's been a very busy man. He's also very graciously shared some of the contents of his museum with us, allowing us to have this current exhibit in the hall, which will be up through the month of March and maybe a few weeks beyond into April, if we can convince Dick of that, because I know there's been a lot of interest in it. So this evening, Dick will speak to us all about the miracle of food production, and I am sure we will learn a lot. Dick, thank you for being here. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I learned the secret of having a pretty lady stand beside you by only having one microphone. Well, I think this is really appropriate, and before I get to our real subject of the miracle of food production, I want to give a little history of food production. This is History Month here at the courthouse. Very appropriately, we're remembering the things, the history of Salem, the surroundings. And food is a big issue in any community. In fact, in the world, because nothing moves without it. None of us would be here. For many centuries, the whole occupation of food production was to exist, and everybody had to take care of their own family, get their own food, raise their own food, shoot their own food, steal it, whatever. And progress developed in the world because of food. Because when they deleted the soil and the surrounding berry bushes and fruit trees and so forth, they just had to pick up and move to a new area where there was more abundant supplies. And so the world advanced in their search for the food supply. And it carried on into even a more sophisticated society. Many of our wars were fought for food. Many of our existence in Europe and the expansion of the countries and the wars that were fought were in search of more food. Even carried on into the modern times. World War II. Hitler went through Poland and Russia when he invaded Russia, ate everything in sight, gathered everything. It's a huge problem to feed an army. And the fact of the matter is, it wasn't just the winter that destroyed him, but the run out of food. And on his trip back to Germany, he'd already destroyed the wheat fields, the corn fields, eaten all the potatoes and the fruit. And starvation was more of an enemy than the Russians were. And that's been repeated through history many times. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with that kind of history of our food supply. But I just want to make a point that here we are in the 20th century and before, and I'm sure, I hope, afterwards. We take food for granted. We don't worry about it. Sure, we listen to television and radio and read the newspaper and see all the scare tactics about food. And isn't it wonderful that our only concern is that we might get sick with something in our food supply rather than being hungry all the time. Let me give you a little history of Washington County. The county was blessed with a great variety of soils and a great variety of topography. It was settled by people mostly from New England, who originally come from Scotland and Ireland. They began to plant the same kind of food supply that they were familiar with, and yet there was hardly anything that they wanted to raise that they couldn't raise in Washington County. There were fruit trees, berries, potatoes, wheat, corn, maple syrup, all kinds of varieties that anybody wanted to raise, they could. In fact, Washington County was the leading county in the nation in the production of potatoes at one time. The leading county in the whole United States. They were also very big in wool production and flax production. And over the years, almost every kind of product used for food and fiber for our clothing was raised in Washington County. Obviously, we weren't too hot on oranges or bananas or those kind of things. But as far as the possibilities, they were tremendous. And the some 3,000 farms that were in Washington County at that time, most farms raised most of those things that I've mentioned because it was still a subsistence society. In the 1800s, about 80% of the population raised their own food. 20% were the professionals, and even in our towns like Salem, most people had chickens, most people had a cow, most people had a big garden, and were very familiar with how to raise food for themselves. And only out on the farms was there any surplus to sell as a cash crop or an income producing after you had enough to feed your family. Not only that, they had much bigger families too. Over the years, it evolved that some farmers were better at some things than others. Some farmers' land was more adaptable to one product than others. And gradually they began to specialize and expand in the kind of area that they had the most interest in, had the soil and equipment and manpower to produce, and the markets to sell the excess. And so we evolved into dropping some products as, even though you could raise them, that you didn't need. I can remember my father saying, driving down the road, that there's a nice looking farm. Everything kept up nice and neat. Machinery's all undercovered, taken care of. He does a great job with the physical part of his farm, but he has an awful time getting milk from cows. And the opposite was true. Maybe it was a rundown place, but boy, could that guy get cows to get a lot of milk. It was a situation that people did what they did best and were good at and didn't have time to do the other things. That was part of the evolution. One of the advantages of the big farms that we have today is that they can specialize. And they can have somebody who is good at taking care of cattle, good at fixing machinery, good at planting crops, and can maximize the opportunities for food production that that kind of multiple use and extra people can provide. Speaking of war again, the Civil War was another example earlier than what I mentioned about the invasion of Russia. The Civil War really devastated the food supply in America. Not only was the manpower gone and the women and children did whatever work was done, but it took a lot of food and to feed the armies that weren't working, that weren't producing. The South was very close to a famine situation. Even the North was very hungry. After the war was over, a monumental thing happened because that was so embedded in their minds, the necessity of food, and nothing moves without it, that Congress passed a law soon after the Civil War establishing land-grant colleges in every state of the Union. Cornell University, Penn State, Purdue, you've heard the names. Every state has one. The state university and the land-grant law required and given money by the federal government to research, experiment, educate how to produce food. It was such a priority that it was viewed as one of the most important pieces of legislation passed in the 19th century. And so ever since, we've had a system all across this country to do research on expanding food production and the ability to produce it, an extension service that followed the land-grant college as a way to disperse the information out onto the rural communities, because obviously only a very small fraction of the population was going to attend the university. And from that piece of legislation has come the most bountiful food-producing nation the world has ever experienced. And yet it took some time to absorb it and use it. New things are resisted, as you all are aware of, and I can hear the farmers saying, this is the way my dad did it, and that's the way I'm going to do it. And it wasn't too many years ago that that was still pretty true, as I see a few farmers in the audience that know it. Nevertheless, the food supply expanded at least on pace with the population. Now that became a question after the First World War and in the Second World War also. In fact, in 1975, after several books were written and said starvation laid ahead, our population had grown so fast we couldn't raise the food to feed them, they had a conference in Rome that predicted by that was in 1975, by the turn of the century, there would be widespread starvation in many parts of the world. There was just no way that we could, with the existing land base available, raise enough food to feed the expanding population. Now, I don't know whether it was in reaction to that conference or whether the people there, it's pretty easy to predict using existing information and existing supplies to predict the future, and it never seems to come out right. But anyways, the Commissioner of Agriculture in Washington made a simple statement and says, well, we'll be able to feed the people of the world because if we can't, they won't be there. Pretty simple. Well, we went from 80% of the population raising their own food with a little left over for the other 20%, to today, 2% of the population raises the food for the rest of the population. In fact, in this country, one farmer, an average farmer, feeds 145 people in this country and 10 people overseas, for 155 people to one farm operation. It is a miracle, absolute miracle. And so I want to tell you a little bit why it happened. It is being criticized, and it's wonderful that we criticize everything about the food supply except the supply itself. We don't experience hunger. People in this country that are hungry is not because of the lack of food, it's the political system or this country and other countries that limits their availability. But the research and progress that developed things that increased the production ability of the American farmer is tremendous, and I want to mention a few of them. Excuse me for using my personal experience as an example, because I lived through a period of time when much of this happened. From the 1800s, when everything was hand power on the farm, with a few tools like plows and harrows and hoes and shovels. From the early 1800s clear through to the early 1900s, we were farming almost the same way that our fathers and grandfathers did. A few minor improvements, a few more major changeovers of operation, but a 100-year period with very little change. Suddenly, about the time of the First World War, and I assume prodded by the fact that the manpower was reduced on the farm, Industrial Revolution that began to make major changes in our industry in the country. Farmers began to accept the research and information that had been developed at our land-grant colleges that I mentioned earlier, and began to realize that rather than improving their operations, they were using up resources and that it couldn't continue. It couldn't continue for their own well-being, for their own income possibilities, for their own families, for the next generation after their families on that farm, but also for the growing non-farm population. And so there was a rapid acceptance of the previous research and development that had taken place in the study of raising plants. The geologists, the plant scientists at the universities had a backlog of information that improved the propagation of many crops. And in the late teens and 20s, these practices began to be used on farms. In the late 20s and 30s, science developed hybrid plants, particularly corn. Corn is a basic commodity, not only in this country, but worldwide. Few crops can produce the tonnage per acre that corn produces. It can be used for a variety of uses, both human, but major livestock. And the fact that our livestock industry can turn unusable plant like alfalfa and corn into food, beef or milk, it expanded rapidly the availability of the food supply. Hybrid corn came in the 30s in this area, and almost in a 2-year period, raised the bushels of corn raised per acre from 25 or 30 bushels the acre to 100. An amazing thing. And farmers looked at it and said, you know, I wonder how it happened. I remember we used to husk corn by hand, save the biggest ears, shell them and plant them the next year because that was the best of the crop, and so they'd plant them and they'd have a better crop the next year. Now we know that the genes in a poor ear of corn are just the same genes in a good one. But the scientists knew that, and they implanted the good genes in the good crop, in the good corn, and farmers stopped raising their own seed corn, using their own seed corn, and bought hybrid seed. This happened in many crops. Then there was another thing that came along about the same time that radically changed. I can remember that one of the evils of farming were weeds. My goodness. We spread manure on the field and the weeds grew faster than the corn did. And we cultivated it with a horse and a one-row cultivator, and that took from the 1st of June to the 1st of July for her to cultivate the corn to save the crop, when we should have been cutting good quality hay. So we not only spent a lot of time and energy because the corn, the weeds used the nutrients that were supposed to go into the corn plant, and we were supposed to be cutting hay to get the best quality hay with the most feed value in June, but we had to cultivate the corn, so we couldn't do it. So the hay crop was cut late, lower content of protein, lower milk production. And so controlling the weeds with a herbicide was a miracle. The first herbicide we used was 2,4-D. And I remember that we spread it on our cornfield, and all that was in the cornfield was corn. The rest of the field was just bare ground. I couldn't believe that was possible. Over the years, they developed more herbicides that were targeted for particular purposes, ones that were less dangerous to the water supply, less injurious to the crop itself. We developed them to improve the quality of the corn or the alfalfa or whatever it was, and improved its nutrition values also at the same time. And suddenly, the average corn production in New York State went from about 50 bushels the acre to 150 bushels the acre over a period of about 10 years. You can imagine what happened. Suddenly the farmer who had 10 cows suddenly had enough feed to feed 20. But he said, boy, I'm getting awful tired of milking by hand. 10 cows is all I can milk. My arms give out. But the researchers developed a milking machine. Electricity came along. A whole lot of things arrived simultaneously. And a problem that was a problem yesterday no longer is a problem tomorrow. And production grew rapidly. I won't belabor the point a great deal because most of you folks are fairly familiar with it, but I'll just give you a few examples. I dispersed my dairy herd in 1978. Herd average was 15,000 pounds of milk. It wasn't the highest in the county, but it was close. Today they're culling cows that don't give 20,000 pounds of milk apiece. Herd averages in the county are running 25 to 30,000 pounds per herd. An amazing change. Brought about by better crops, better feed systems, brought about by farmers who are scientists, who are very good at their job. We heard a little bit about sustainable agriculture today. Let me tell you, you talk to third and fourth generation farmers like Chambers, Sheldons, Skelly's, Allens and Easton, Geddes, and many more. They're here because they have learned to be sustainable. They've done the right things. Their land is better every year rather than poorer. They have learned the science and technology that is necessary to perpetuate and improve what they do. Many farmers have left. Many farmers have quit. There's a lot of reasons for it. Hard work, a lot of gamble, a paycheck not every Saturday night, Friday night, sometimes none at all. You have to like the job first, but more than that, you have to be adaptable to change and change rapidly. You have to be able to take a risk. I had a radio program in Argyle in Glens Falls, and a farmer from Argyle called me up on the phone and says, I've listened to your radio program every Saturday morning for a while, and one thing you said is very important. The rest of them was just listened to. Your farm is an experiment station. When a salesman comes out and sells you the greatest seed corn in the world, you don't have to decide to plant the whole thing to that seed corn. You can plant an acre and find out. And it's true in a whole lot of things. And farmers did that. And they improved by their own research. They proved or disproved. They found out whether their farm was the right place to have that crop grow. One of the great things in the dairy industry was when artificial insemination came along. And the very best bulls in the world were available to improve our breeding stock, improve our milking herd. It's even gone one beyond that now. Now we can have all heifer calves. Now we can have predictability in a cow because we know exactly the gene structure of the animal that baby calf represents. It is absolutely amazing. I thought that maybe individual cows would get to 30,000 pounds of milk, but it's possible to get much beyond that. Now we have whole herds averaging that amount. What is the possibility in the future? People would use the available information, the statistics of today, and predict that we're going to starve to death when we reach 9 million in 2050. Having a single thought of all the things that are going to happen to improve food production in the next decade even. It is moving very rapidly. It's a wonderful world we live in, but none of us would enjoy a day of it without eating. Governments can make great plans on traveling to the moon or Mars, great plans on what the masses are going to do, great plans of what governments are going to do in the world scene. But if they don't sit down to a good meal tonight, suddenly all those other plans disappear. The miracle of agriculture is suddenly in the hands of 2% of the population. You realize that? 2% of the population are producing the food for the world. That's critical. And we've had such a history of being bountifully fed that we worry about obesity. We worried that there's something in the chocolate milk that hadn't ought to be there. So they scare the kids away from drinking chocolate milk. Or a few years back when I was commissioner, suddenly somebody discovered that Alar was a poison and they were spraying our apple trees with it. My God. I had school principals in New York City calling me and said, we just threw away a whole year's supply of apple juice we had for our cafeterias. Dumped it down the drain. Well, I said I should report you to the Environmental Conservation Department for pollution. But it's amazing how the food police pick up on little things and scare us at our food supply. It's amazing, and yet if you really think about it, it's a blessing. We're in such an abundant supply of good food that our worries are little things that on the peripheral of our existence. Alar, for example, was a poison, is a poison. It was put on apple trees so that a disease that was rotting a little bit of the stem of an apple so that the apples dropped off before they got ripe. Had nothing to do with the apple, nothing to do with the tree. It was targeted at a problem, it corrected the problem, and it was a poison that did it. And poisons have great good things for people of this country if they're used appropriately by people that know how to use them. And I'm just telling you that the American farmer has become an expert at rebuilding his soil, using the available aids, tools, poisons, the right time, the right place, the right product, for the right reason, and we all benefit from it. There are a lot of buzzwords going around today about our food supply. There's people that are vegetarians, and that's fine. There's people that won't eat meat. There are people that eat too much meat. But the point is, we have a choice. They don't have much choice in Africa or many other places in the world. And I just want to stress to you that the miracle of food production started here in this country, has increased in this country, is still the best in the world, but you just want to remember only 2% of the population knows how to turn those resources and the science and the research and all the things that go with it into feeding you every day. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sure you've got some questions.
Dick, I was looking at a magazine today, and the headline of the magazine was Europeans Fight Genetically Modified Seeds, Too Late for the United States. What's the controversy here?
It's a controversy like even we things we don't know anything about. So it's exclusive to it's just different subject matters. They have one example. About 10 years ago, they discovered a gene in strawberries that was very resistant to cold weather, and they inserted it into the seed plants in strawberries, and now 10 years later, we're having strawberries every day in our stores. Because now they can raise strawberries at least 200 miles farther north in this country than they ever could before. Because they will withstand early frost. That's just one example. But in the major food supplies of the world, wheat, soybeans, and corn, we'll just put those three. The big seed corn companies used to develop seed in Hawaii and in some of the other Pacific islands, where they could almost raise 3 crops a year. Didn't have to wait so long. We could speed up the development of new plants. We've been doing experimentation with crops and seeds for 150 years. Suddenly, there's 2 men on Long Island Creek, and forget the other man's name, discovered the way to identify individual genes. Within a very few years, they found the good ones, the bad ones, the ones that worked, ones that didn't, and they've been able suddenly to revolutionize the whole thing of the breeding process. It's even happening, as I mentioned, a little bit in cows now, but particularly in plants. And I've got a handout for you to take home and read. This is as new as February 2nd this year. Newly discovered scarecrow gene could boost food production. Titled Cornell University years ago. And so I'm going to pass these out. But the gene is something new, and it's done by man. It isn't natural. It doesn't happen only by accident in nature. And so there's people in the world that have resisted it and say we have not been doing it. The real thing in Europe is that they want to protect their own farmers who weren't using it from imports from other countries. And so they're using it as a trade barrier when the Association of the Countries in the GATT negotiations is a general agreement on tariff and trade. There's certain things you can't do. You can't have tariffs and so on and so forth. But if you find something in the product that your people are afraid of, you can stop it being shipped into your country. So the first job is to scare the people. And the people got very good at it. And the communication system we've got today helps them do it. So the first thing you do is you scare the people. Then you try to limit the production of the product that you've scared them already that something's wrong with it. And then you win the war, or you win the argument. It's happened in a lot of things. And we've been deprived of a lot of things that we could be already enjoying. Cheaper food in a lot of areas by the people that don't think we should use science, don't think we should use research, who think we should go back to the way they farmed 50 years ago, but they still like to eat. And so we are beneficiaries of a tremendous operating machine out here, but operated by very few people. Here's a single sheet on both sides, and then here's another one. Any other questions? I was counting on more questions because
When was the big jump in the corn production? How many years ago?
yeah, both in tonnage. Now, it's a good point. Corn is a major crop in the United States, major crop in the world. As I mentioned, back in the 30s, we got about 10 ton of corn silage per acre. That's when you go into the field and cut the whole plant, chop it into small pieces, go in your silo, and now you get bulk silage. About 80% of the corn in New York State was fed to livestock. There's a whole plant of silage for the dairy herds. In the Midwest and now increasingly in New York State, we're raising corn for grain. One is it's less volume to handle, less storage problems, easily shipped worldwide, and there's a growing market for it. There's a growing market even for ethanol. Obviously, there's a big market now for ethanol. So, in that period of time, as that market was there and growing, so was the research on corn. And now it is common to raise 200 bushel of corn to the acre in shelled corn. In the West, and even in a few places in New York State, we reached 275, bordering on 300 bushels the acre. They're planting narrower rows, about 40,000 plants the acre instead of 25. And corn in itself is yielding better. Corn is self-pollinated. It isn't dependent on the bees to pollinate corn. And it is becoming an increasingly important crop because of its many, many uses. So I hate to use individuals, but you're familiar with Sheldon's farm here and the size of farm. There's about 15 of those same size farms in the county. In fact, Sheldon's producing enough milk for a glass of milk for every person in Washington County every day in one place. A glass of milk for every person, 50,000 people in Washington County. A glass of milk every day from just that one farm. But, stop and think of it. It takes an awful lot of feed to feed those cattle. It takes a lot of acreage to grow it. If we were back to the production levels of corn and alfalfa in the 30s, there wouldn't be a Sheldon farm there. Nobody could travel far enough to get enough acres to grow enough corn at the levels of production per acre that we had in the 30s. So things had to move together. Capability to grow feed, capability to milk cows, capability to put together all the ingredients of a successful operation. And it takes a lot of people, a lot of study, a lot of training, a lot of research to get to that point. It didn't happen overnight, but we're there. And it isn't stopping, it's going on even greater. We've all got hands. Charlie?
In places where the soil has got bad and so forth, some of your major cities that are now trying to do some things with hydroponics and things along that line. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, you bring up two good points, Charlie. One is, and I should have mentioned the first one before, in the kind of farms we have in Washington County, everybody that had 200-300 acres of land had a variety of soils on that 200 acres. There's 7 classifications of land. The highest classification is muck. That's where dried up lakes and so forth have 8 or 10 feet of black soil that will raise anything. You throw some seeds out on it, you better get out of the road, you'll get blown up behind you. But there's very limited amount of that, obviously. Then you have class 6 and class 5, which we have a lot of class 5 in Washington County, a little class 6. The land, the flat lands down along the Badkill River, down Skelly's Road. Some of the land that Sheldon's got over along the Hudson River are class 6, where there were once floodplains. I'm going to get to your question, Charlie. Once floodplains. Number 5 is the gravelly loams that are easily worked, not too hilly, some hilly, good drainage. Number 4 is a little the same thing, or not so much good qualities. You get down to 3, where we used to have all our pastures, where we had our cattle grazing, sheep grazing, hilly land. Once in a while you plowed it up and seeded down the new seed. 2 and 1 held the rest of the world together. Rocks, not usable. You know, when ethanol first came on and price of corn jumped, it was about 6-7 years ago. A fellow here in Salem, a good friend of all of us, you know him well, says to me, boy, I would think that farmers would be out planting every side hill they got in Washington County. Doesn't work that way. It costs them more to do it than they get off of it, than they yield. And so what I'm saying is that over the years, the people have adjusted their operations and what they're growing to the type of soil and the type of fields they've got. Now it comes to what Charlie just said. The same kind of research going on in our things have, in our colleges, have developed in the process they have been raising hydroponics because they can raise them year-round and do their experimentations on them. They discovered that their graduate students got out of school and they said, hey, they're raising tomatoes out there year-round. I guess I'll do it. And they're doing it successfully. And over in Argyle, they raised, was one of the first ones they had, raised tomatoes, and they experimented with a lot of other crops. And there's unlimited things you can raise, but not necessarily economically. But it is growing and it will grow. Up in Canada, it takes a lot of electricity, so there's quite an expense to it. Up in Canada, between Montreal and Quebec, in the province of Quebec, they put a program in by their government about 20 years ago to supply free electricity for all the people up there, farmers up there that raise crops, so they didn't have to import them from Florida. And so they've got greenhouses from one end of the province to the other. And it's successfully raising beans and radishes and all kinds of things. Because the government is paying for the cost of doing it. I don't think our government's going to do that. But nevertheless, it can be done. And it will happen in specialty crops, high value crops that are particularly adaptable to that kind of an operation.
I was fascinated watching the PBS documentary on the Dust Bowl, and of course the impact it had on food production back in the early 20th century. Did we ever experience anything like that in this region?
No.
Middle West, wasn't it?
Up until now, the research that's been adapted mostly is in the major crops. I don't know when it began to how do I say this? There are people that don't eat some products. The people that religions limit the use of some products. There are ethnic groups, Long Island, for example, now used to raise potatoes. There's still agriculture in New York City. You know what they're doing? They're raising ethnic vegetables for all the ethnic groups in New York City. So the complexion of our agriculture is changing when the necessity or the opportunity arise to do it. Bruce?
There's a man named Bill Kretinger who's a barn expert, and he has told me that the major crop in this area was wheat. Now, I never heard my father mention wheat or anything else, or any evidence of wheat being grown here, but I assume the farmers weren't dairy farmers in the beginning, so I assume they had to grow something to sell. I know we were leaving Potato County, but are you familiar with us growing any kinds of grains for export?
Farmers in this area didn't grow wheat, you're right.
They did, or they
Didn't much.
I argued with him, but he
The reason is that the major wheat growers are winter wheat. It's planted in the September and October, harvested the next July. We were a little bit too far north to use it on much of our land, and oats took its place. Now we don't even raise much oats. I remember on the field across from the old Agway plant down on Route 29, those fields that Sheldon's have now. I rented that one time, it had corn growing on it, and it had beautiful corn by the 4th of July, and then dried up every year from then on because of sandy, leachable soil, and it never got any bigger in August than it was in July. So finally I planted to winter wheat. And I remember when they were building that concrete tower down there that somebody put a sign up at the same time that they had the food symposium in Rome that I talked about. And somebody put a sign out there that said Russian experiment station. I had a terrific crop of wheat. But you go into the One of the things about wheat is it's grown mostly on the high western plains, winter wheat where the moisture is in the wintertime and not in the summer. And it's also grown in Pennsylvania and south where they double crop, they take off the wheat crop, plant soybeans, and harvest them in the fall and turn it back into wheat again. But it's just one of those things that the farmers themselves have sorted out what is a successful crop on their land and what isn't.
I just wanted to say that the backstory or the behind-the-scenes history that you've given us is so interesting. You lived it, and what you didn't live, you studied, and so it's very enlightening. The things that are more obvious to us are things that we see every day, like the machinery. If you could do a whole program just on some of the machinery you have in the hall compared to those monster big things that go down the road. But we were at the farm show a couple of weeks ago and saw a lot of the big machinery, and I just think there's some ingenuity and
Well, for the next hour, I can tell you about what's going to happen.
to my big machines.
It's amazing. You can't even imagine. I mean, I remember folks saying that, and I made a speech once at Farm Bureau that your children are going to be using things that you haven't even dreamt of yet. It's absolutely true. I know of at least 10 farms in western New York, dairy farms, and there's probably more by now. They're milking their cows with robots, never touched by human hands. A robot milking a unit will handle about 60 cows. So you've got some farms out there that have got 5, 6, 7, or 8 robots. They cost $275,000 per unit. They put them in a loose housing operation, and the cows will walk in whenever they want to. And you'd be amazed how quick they learn it, and how often some cows will be milked 8 or 10 times a day. Some cows maybe once or twice. But it's coming. I asked the Shillings if they were interested in it, because they've certainly been pioneers in milking it. And Jim told me yes. But you know why? How? They put it on a separate unit. They might put one out on another farm. Not changing what they're doing here, but experimentation with how it works. They might put one down on Hank's farm or something. Put in a unit, put 50, 60 cows down there, and learn from it. And that's what's happening all across the country. And the mechanization, we were out in Illinois to visit friends of mine, and last fall, he raises 1,200 acres of corn. Gosh, he's go to Hawaii twice every year if he wants to. Those things I handed out have got some statistics in there that'll be interesting to you. And some new ideas, and probably contradict some things I've already told you.